Morning, everyone. We'll start today's meeting. Aloha mai kako. This is the December 6th, 2023 Land Use Commission meeting. This is an in-person meeting in which is being held at the State Office Tower, room 405, 235 South Beretania Street, room 405, as I said, Honolulu, 96813. And this meeting is open to the general public. Court reporting transcripts are being done from this Zoom recording of this meeting, but in my understanding, the Zoom is not being broadcast publicly. Contemporaneously, correct? All meeting participants, I'd like to stress the importance of speaking slowly, clearly, and directly into your microphone. Before speaking, please state your name and identify yourself for the record. As I said, even though this is an in-person meeting, please be aware that all meeting participants are being recorded on the digital record of this Zoom meeting for reporting purposes only. Your continued participation is your implied consent to be part of the public record of this event. If you do not wish to be part of the public record, you should exit the meeting now. My name is Dan Giovanni. I have the pleasure to serve as the LUC chair. We currently have 9 seated commissioners, all present today. Along with me from Maui is Lee Ohigashi. From Oahu is Commissioner Gary Okuda. From Kauai is Commissioner Michael Yamane. Also from Oahu is Commissioner Mel Kahele and Commissioner Koike Kamakea Ohelo, Commissioner George Ata, Commissioner Brian Lee. And from the Big Island, Hawaii Island, is Commissioner Nancy Carr-Smith. Also in attendance are the LUC Executive Director, Daniel Orendecker, LUC Chief Planner, Scott Derrickson, LUC Staff Planner, Martina Segura, LUC Chief Clerk, Ariana Kwan, and to my left, LUC Attorney General, Julie Chino. Again, court reporting transcriptions are being done from Zoom. Our first order of business is the adoption of the minutes from our meeting of November 15 and 16. Ms. Kwan, has there been any written testimony submitted on the minutes from November 15 and 16?
No, Mr. Chair.
Are there any members of the public here today who have signed up and wish to testify about the minutes, November 15 and 16?
No, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Commissioners, are there any corrections or comments on the minutes? If not, is there a motion to adopt the minutes for November 15 and 16? Commissioner Ohigashi.
Mr. Chair, I move to adopt the minutes November 15th and 16th of 2023.
Thank you. Is there a second? Who was that? Commissioner Ata provides a second to the minute. All in favor of adoption of the minutes for November 15 and 16, please say aye. Is anyone opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are adopted. The next agenda item is the tentative meeting schedule. Mr. Orendecker, will you bring us up to date?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is our last meeting in December. In January, we have currently scheduled January 24th at the Foreign Trade Zone for the Halikua Development Status Report. On February 7th, we have the GAMREX Inc. status report. And on February 21st, we have the AMFAC/HHFDC status report scheduled.
Where are those?
So on the 7th, we will be in Kona, and on 21st, we'll be on Maui. And 22nd is tentatively set aside for a review, another review of the proposed rule amendments. That may change depending on when we can schedule meetings with interested parties. In March, we had tentatively have scheduled on March 20th on Oahu, the Waimanalo Gulch matter. Once again, that is tentative. We're waiting to see what the county's timeline is going to be to get the documents to us. And that takes us through April. once again, we request that the commissioners keep the tentative dates open until we release them.
So what were the April dates?
April, we have nothing scheduled.
What are the tentative dates?
Yeah, the April dates would be April 3rd and 4th, April 17th and 18th. And in May, the tentative dates are May 8th and 9th and the 22nd and 23rd.
Okay, so I know off just speaking for myself, the latter April dates, I will be unavailable. I don't know about others, but so let me encourage all commissioners to inform LUC staff of their availability of these tentative dates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Our fourth order of business is presentation on the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development's soil classification study. Ms. Kwan, is there any public testimony that I should recognize? Written public testimony on this matter?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there anybody in attendance that wishes to provide testimony today?
No public is in the room, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So now we'll proceed. Is OPSD available to provide the presentation on the soil study? I do not see them in attendance.
We have a YouTube video to show.
Very good. This is from OPSD.
Yeah, Chair.
Let me recognize Scott Derrickson for an update.
Yeah, for the record, Scott Derrickson, Chief Planner, State Land Use Commission. I'm going to say a few words and then we'll watch the video regarding the soil study. Just as background, so Act 189 in the legislative session in 2022 required OPSD to, one, evaluate the current soil classification systems that are used in Hawaii, develop recommendations to improve their role in agricultural land regulation, and request appropriate assistance from the State Department of Ag, UH College of Tropical Ag and Human Resources, the Land Use Commission, and if applicable, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. OPSD Land Division is responsible for managing the contract, the outreach, the interim report that they're going to deliver in this session 2024, and a final report they plan to deliver for the 2025 session. $325,000 was appropriated for that study. The study is partly a response to concerns by landowners and government regulatory bodies about the lack of a clear way to either update the existing information or amend the Land Study Bureau ratings based on new information. The LSB ratings are incorporated into HRS 205-2 and 205-4.5B as a method to limit the permissible uses on the best lands to primarily agricultural activities. It is the de facto reference for regulating lands within the state agricultural district, including when state special permits might be required. LUC staff has participated in ongoing steering committee meetings conducted by Supersistence LLC and OPSD Land Use Division between July and November 2023. A recent meeting held on November 30th of the steering committee discussed and reviewed an initial draft of the interim report. This interim report will be sent to the legislature prior to the session. This represents the first phase of OPSD LUD's study. OPSD was asked about 2 months ago to provide an overview of the soil study to the LUC at its tentative December meeting today. They declined. Therefore, we're going to watch a YouTube video produced by OPSD Land Use Division and post it to their public-facing website that provides an overview of the soil classification study.
Would you like to proceed with the video at this time?
And then once the video is completed, we can entertain questions.
Very good.
Okay.
Is this a publicly available YouTube video?
I'm sorry, OPSD does have this posted on their, as I said, public facing webpage regarding the soil classification study.
So for the record, can you give us the exact name of the video so if anybody wants to look it up on their own?
It's called Soils Classification Systems and Use in Regulating Agricultural Land Study presentation.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and evening. As Aaron said, my name is Hunter Hevelin. I'm a food systems planner, and my firm Supersistence has the contract with the state to pursue this important effort to delve into our soil classification systems and their use in the regulation of agricultural lands. And without further ado, we're going to start off with a bit of an agenda overview of kind of how things are going to flow for the day, and jump right in. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and drop your name and affiliation in the chat. So this effort, as articulated on the bottom here, is actually funded by the state through Act 189, passed in 2022, to study our soil classification systems, and particularly through the lens of their application in the regulation of our agricultural lands in both the state and the county layers. So over the course of the day today, we're going to, if you go to the next slide, please, give a little bit of the project background, just kind of who's here, why we're here, as well as looking at our soil classification systems, somewhat of a, somewhere between a wade and a deep dive. I hope folks have had a chance to take a gander at the story map that was included in the invite emails. If not, hopefully we can get that pasted in the chat here for folks to click through and see at your leisure, conceivably another time. But after our soil classification review, we're going to also talk briefly about the way that some of these systems are integrated into our land use regulation, have a bit of a discussion about what we learned, kind of a Q&A on that, and then have a much more interactive portion where we're actually having a discussion about how we use these systems, their strengths and weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement, and ways that we might reframe or approach to explore how they could address some of the issues we face this century. And then we'll conclude with a quick review and talk about our next steps. All right. So for the blessed few, if any, who have never been on Zoom before, there's a few functions that we're going to be probably relying on over the course of this. There's a chat function in there. I think everybody's managed to put their name through. And you can use that chat function to share questions as we go on throughout. Raise your hand if you'd need as well. Also, I suppose flailing wildly could work in a group of this size. But just by whatever mechanism, we want to make sure to get your queries heard and addressed, though we may not necessarily do so in the course of the presentation. We'll certainly do so at the Q&A portion. So how did we get here? This project, as I said earlier, was funded by the state through Act 189. And in that legislation actually articulates that we are to have some, you could say, guidance provided through a steering committee that's composed of members from the State Department of Agriculture, from the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, as well as from the State Land Use Commission. So we have representatives from each of those entities who we've been have met with over the course of this process to help kind of steer and understand some of the opportunities, caveats, and so forth. The project is going to conclude with some reports to the legislature, and it will then be in their trusted hands to hopefully carry some of your voice and our work forward. So the team we have here today, as I said earlier, I'm Hunter Hevelin with Supersistence. I have the primary contract, but was able to assemble a crack team of experts to help pursue uncovering the various soil layers. And so we have representatives here today from G70, Barb and Ethan, if you guys give us a wave. They're leading the outreach efforts for this project. Not joining us, we actually have a soil scientist that we brought on particularly to be informing some of the perspectives around soil health, soil carbon, We are also very lucky to have Bruce Plash from Plash Econ Pacific, longtime agricultural economist and planner, who I learn something from every time we chat, as well as Dr. Azan Iwashiko, an anthropologist by training who has been helping to wrangle together all of the various notes, ideas, concepts, and processes that we have going on. So for the effort overall, our work plan is really broken into 2 phases. The first being looking at the classification systems in depth, compiling their relevant regulations, as well as looking at some of the external, or rather other jurisdictions, then seeing how they approach some of these issues and the extent to which any of those may have some best practices we could draw from. We also have a initial outreach phase. This is nearing the latter portion of that. And then we're going to very hastily, well, I shouldn't say hastily, very quickly, also concomitantly be producing a preliminary report, an interim report to the legislature about the progress of the study so far. After those portions are done, we're going to take all of your recommendations and all of our research work and produce a set of preliminary recommendations. And then we're going to come back in the fall, or rather in the spring, to solicit some more info, and then we'll conclude with a final report to the legislature. Go to the next slide. So for that community engagement portion, we started off with 3 focus groups that were sort of the technical legal expertise. We had agriculture, environment, land use, energy, landowners, a variety of different perspectives to really try and build a robust corpus of ideas about how these systems are used. And then we've now moved through a series of kind of more county-focused discussions, even though we've been inviting folks who couldn't make it to prior ones to jump in wherever they can. And so these county group efforts are what we're in the middle of. We've got one more next week. But as I said earlier, once we are have completed our preliminary set of recommendations, we're actually going to come back and hopefully see you again sometime in the spring to review the recommendations that we've produced and have another opportunity for feedback to make sure we got it all right. In terms of other opportunities for engagement, there's some, well, I should say a variety of useful informations on the project website, including overlay maps, some historical background context, as well as some deep dives into the soil systems. There's also a discussion tool that we're going to be using a little bit later today. And we'll also be posting up some of the meeting summaries and recordings and some of the interim and final findings. In terms of the schedule for the effort overall, we're aiming to be completed about a year from now. And in the next 12 months, as I said, interim report, initial recommendations, some additional outreach, and then concluding with a final report. So what are we doing here today? As I said at the top, we're really hoping to explore how current soil systems, our soil classification systems, are used and how they can be improved. So we want to better understand how, or if you use any of these soil classification systems, your perspectives on their strengths and weaknesses, as well as exploration of, if you are aware of another jurisdiction that does something great, we'd like to hear about that as well. Before we go into the next phase here, just see if there are any initial questions about what we're doing here or why you're here. We can take those now. And otherwise, I'll just go ahead and move into our classification portion. All right. So, soil classification systems. We've got a lot of different ways to measure and approach the world. And we're going to talk about 4 that have been played a role here, or that were uniquely developed here, and that currently are at least integrated in one way or another into our regulatory systems. The first is the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Services Soil Survey Geographic Database, rolls right off the tongue, also called SURGO. Others might shorthand it as just NRCS. Then we're going to go into the efforts of the Land Study Bureau, also commonly known as the LSB. Following that, looking at the ag lands of importance to the state of Hawaii, or ALISH, and concluding with a review of the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment Program, or LISA. So if you hear me using names or acronyms, that would be, I will do my best to reduce that, but it may slip out. So first off is the NRCS Surgo database. This is a high resolution database that has 130 some odd different facets of information about a given soil. And these are used for everything from land use planning to agricultural assessments to engineering. And the database has been developed from information collected really over the course of a century here. So the early surveying work that happened in the islands, our first territorial survey, I should say, was released in 1955, but was based off of data collected in the mid-30s that concluded in the late 30s. However, the delay of that report was delayed in its release due to World War II. And that effort involved, traversing across landscapes along most of the islands, I should say, and as well as doing soil sampling in many cases, and in other spaces where there was maybe less agricultural activity, they resorted to some oral accounts from producers. So in those cases, I might have been talking with ranchers or landowners or farmers about how they perceive the quality and the issues of the land. That islands-wide effort was updated along with the soil taxonomical systems in the early 70s. So in 72, 73, even thicker set of documents was released that was based off of updated aerial photos and topographic maps. Subsequent to that, we have not had a islands-wide, a statewide update of our soil classification, of our soil survey. However, the Surgo database does get annual refreshes where there can be slight modifications, or as soil science as a field continues to progress, there may be recategorizations, or if there are particular issues or landform changes, for example, a lava flow on the Big Island, that they remap what is now a very different ground cover, or a very different ground even. So this is, while a very robust system that includes a whole lot of different layers within it, one of which mapped here is what's called the land capability class. And this is a system developed by the USDA for grading land based off of the limitations for its use for productive commercial agriculture. This is just one of the many layers included. And it's used for a variety. In a number of states, the land capability classification is actually incorporated into some of their regulatory structures, whereas for us, it was incorporated into later soil system analyses, soil classifications, which I'll touch on. The Surgo database is commonly used for a lot of different research efforts. For example, CTAR's Hawaii Soil Atlas or other crop suitability modeling is often underpinned with data coming out of the Surgo database. So while robust and having complete coverage, as well as Hawaii being the first state to have complete coverage in the early 80s, can be a little tricky to use, right? You have a spatial data set, you have a tabular data set, you need to be able to join those and figure out which of the 150 some odd columns you want to be mapping or using in your analysis. So it's what it may long for in some usability. In some cases, it has significant strength in that it does receive some updates, and it does contain a robust volume of information. However, after those early soil surveys, so the one particularly that was released in 1955, as the state was increasing its population, the territorial legislature moved on to the creation of a Land Study Bureau. And so the Land Study Bureau was created in 1957, ran for just shy of 20 years, and was really framed at providing, we could say, objective information for land use planning and development across the state. So at that time, we were having a significant rise in population. There was concerns around urban encroachment into agricultural lands, and agriculture at the time was, of course, the dominant industry, which was noted in their early reporting work. The LSB was charged with the production of classifications and approaches that could help inform effective land use planning. So what they ended up creating was an overall master productivity rating, which is on a scale from A being the best quality lands to E being the lowest rated. They only did this for agricultural lands, so it doesn't have a complete spatial coverage across the state. but it was a very robust system. So they actually took the averages of 7 different crop or agricultural land uses in terms of their yield, turned that into one output of a productivity rating, and then they had another system that was all about the soil texture and slope and and land position, and that was another productivity rating. They factored those together, and that became our overall productivity rating. Or rather, they aligned those with one another, I should say, not a factor system. This is arguably the most commonly used system in our regulatory structure, and currently frames the types of uses for agriculturally districted lands, and is often used in the development of agricultural zones at the county levels. So while it is statewide, it does not include any of the urban areas, and this map, for example, was updated by the Office of Planning some years ago to reflect shifts in the land use district boundary as the urban areas expanded. That being said, it does not include in any of its digitized data all of that rich information about crop yield projections, or some of the interior pieces to the sort of soil profile data as well. So lots of information, but again, not necessarily entirely accessible unless you happen to have a bunch of copies of old texts from the 60s through the 70s to go through page by page to really understand the different land units that they were analyzing with. Shortly after, the Land Study Bureau was defunded, in part because the legislature had felt like they were repeating studies, and in fact, they did do a detailed classification mapping effort for Oahu in both 1963 and 1972. They lost their funding, but the interest in protecting important agricultural lands and in agricultural land governance did not go away. So not very long thereafter, the Agricultural Lands of Importance to the State of Hawaii effort, which was forged. And so this was really a partnership between the Natural Resource Conservation Service, CTAR, as well as the Hawaii Department of Ag, following a federal Soil and Water Resources Conservation Act. So the intent there was for the SCS, this is the Soil Conservation Service, the precursor to the NRCS, was to inventory prime agricultural lands across the nation. So the Hawaii ALISH, I believe it was termed an ad hoc committee, was tasked with trying to understand how we would identify these lands. And while they inherited wholesale the prime definition that the federal government was utilizing, they created a special classification called unique to identify lands that were for traditional crops or other high value crops, kalo, coffee, watercress, for example, that if you were to be using a prime classification that might be well tailored to the Midwest, certainly wouldn't be recognizing, flooded lo'i as a prime land, right? So they created a special classification system to be sure to capture the unique aspects of Hawaii agriculture. And the last category was an other category, which was for lands that had some limits to their productivity, but were not necessarily we're not immediately in prime use or ready for it. So as this was criteria based, the coverage is not statewide. It just identified certain areas, and including the areas that were identified back in the 70s. There were also incorporated as a consideration in the standards and criteria for important agricultural lands in 1983. Not wanting to let the efforts fall to the wayside, this notion of ag lands of importance to the state became further enshrined in our Constitution during the 1978 CONCON, which had framed that we needed to go about the identification of important agricultural lands. And so the next effort, which again had a relationship with some federal interests, was called the Land Evaluation and Site Assessment Programming. And so this was again growing out of a national push. The LISA system was first developed in Orange County, New York, adopted by the SCS or NRCS at the time, expanded, and Hawaii was again one of the first states to try and really explore writ large how these systems could be developed. So Act 273 in 1983 created the LISA Commission, and that commission was tasked with the identification of important agricultural lands and to develop and propose, regulations to help protect those lands. So the LISA Commission took in the LISA system, rather, there's two major components: land evaluation, which is more akin to the soils, topography, climate, those kinds of factors, and which actually also included an output from LSB, which was called the Modified Story Rating Index, as well as an output from what we now call SERGO, which was the Land Capability Classification. So these systems kind of weave into one another as the decades go on. The other component, not beyond land evaluation, was called site assessment, which is really then thinking about what's the context of this parcel within the broader development plan. And so how does it relate or not to county or state development plans? What is its surrounding infrastructure that could enable access to markets through transportation, and a variety of other, I think 10 in total other facets of that site assessment portion. These were then weighted and came up with a threshold, essentially, where if you got a score above a certain amount, then you are now mapped as an important agricultural land. However, despite the legislature having said that we needed to identify this, and then this effort moving forward, we did not, despite a few other testimonies and bills put forward to actually adopt this process, we did not indeed do so. So the LISA system is one of the least regularly surfaced in our regulatory systems. I managed to find it buried in a couple of administrative rules, but nothing in our Hawaii revised statutes, at least that I've managed to find so far. So, and again, as it's criteria based, it is not statewide, but the inputs to it echo somewhat what's currently present in Act 183 from 2005 for our IAL criteria. So while there's that list of site assessment and land evaluation components look very, very similar to what you see as the standards and criteria for our IAL designations or for our IAL petitions. With that, I'm going to take a deep breath, and I hope we can get some questions from the group and hear a little bit more about what you know about these, how you've interacted with them, and take any other clarifying questions or perspectives. I think to the point on how some of these start to interface, maybe I'll go through just a couple of slides here on the way that we've found these kind of engaging with some of the policy work. So I think one of the main systems, at least that I had been most familiar with prior, was just thinking about the permissible uses within the ag districts, right? So if folks aren't versed in planning lingo, we essentially have zoning at the county levels and then districts at the state level. We were the first state to adopt essentially a statewide zoning system, which is our state land use districts. If this is confusing, I apologize. There's a slightly better explanation on the website. But essentially those ag land use districts are governed in part the types of uses based off of the LSB land quality. And thinking about the soil data that was available at the time, which was coming from that 1955 territorial survey, which was based off a 1939 field work, we can draw a through line to say that a producer's perspective, a farmer, a landowner, a rancher in the mid-30s who was asked about their land quality is now factored into whether or not you can build a solar farm in the 2030s, which is an interesting, I would think maybe not explicitly, but feeds into the rationale for why we're here today, right? To explore, well, what else should we be considering? How could we have a system that is robust and addresses the myriad interests and concerns of both producers and planners? So that's kind of the ag land use districts at the county level. There are some other ones. We pop to the next slide. So for example, as I said, regulating solar development, Honolulu's golf course governance, as well as some other slides on the other pieces that are more about detailed zoning aspects, for example, with districts, particularly agricultural districts in Hawaii County, where they actually break out like a farm family agriculture versus an intensive agricultural district. So this is just really intended to just kind of give the highest level overview of the types of ways that these are integrated into our planning processes. But we are interested to hear what else you think would be important to include in these kinds of systems, or what you think the strengths and weaknesses are of them as you've experienced them thus far, whether that's thus far in your life or just thus far in your evening.
Okay, Scott, Land Use Commission again. So that is what the Office of Planning has up on their website now, to kind of explain to anyone who's interested what this soil classification study that was required of them by the legislature consists of, and kind of what they're looking at moving into the future. So there will be an interim report going to the legislature towards the end of this month, and it will be public at that point.
So thank you, Scott. I just had one quick question and then we could open up for more, but over the last month, I know I received, I don't know if other commissioners received a survey that seemed to be tied to this study. Is that something you're familiar with?
No, I'm not, but I'm not surprised, because I think they're trying to broadly reach out and find anybody who might want to provide input. Because I'm attending as staff to the steering committee, that's what I'm locked into.
Because it wasn't clear how those, I mean, I interpreted that, this is Giovanni, I interpreted that to be a form of outreach.
Correct.
I'm not sure to whom it was sent.
Right.
And it wasn't clear how the feedback to the survey would be utilized in the process that this contractor is.
Right.
You know anything about that?
I do. As I said, the last meeting we had on November 30th, the steering committee was looking at the draft interim report, and included in the draft interim report is, kind of a collection of all the input that they've received, both from steering committees as well as through surveys, as well as online comments that they've gotten as well.
Okay, let me open up questions, Mr. Alta.
I
Commissioner
was
Alta?
just wondering, Dan, if the survey they were talking about, the one that Group 70 does, right now, they're actively working with Office of State Planning, and I've been attending some of them things. So.
I don't recall if it was or was not managed by G70. Do you know, Scott?
Well, okay, there's a prime contractor, which is this, you saw the gentleman who was presenting, Hunter Haviland. His company is called Super Assistance LLC. They're the prime contractor. G70 is one of the sub-consultants, and they have, a fairly large role in terms of the outreach work.
It's my connection. So.
Yeah, so I think some of what Dan and I will be presenting next, you'll see some of the tie-in with this project that OPSD is involved in.
Okay, well, let me turn it over. Unless there's a question by commissioners, we'll turn it back to the staff for further presentation. Commissioner Okuda.
Thank you, Chair. So Scott, since the statute which governs us, a lot of times it says that our powers have to be applied based on ratings of the land A, B, C, D, whatever. So is the underlying goal here to update really where authority should be exercised and what kind of authority should be exercised? Or, and related to that, the assumption or the underlying assumption of the of this group moving forward as directed by the legislature is we're basically operating on kind of like stale or data which is kind of like old and not reliable.
Thank you, Commissioner Okuda. This is Dan Hardenker, the Executive Officer for the Land Use Commission. The answer to that is yes and no. I was actually actively involved in moving this concept through the legislature. It's not what we originally envisioned. Part of the problem that we have and the way this originated was that we had various petitioners saying to staff, look, this is rated A, B, but it's not. It's really not. And these are the reasons why. And our response was, well, we don't have a mechanism to change it. So when we first approached the legislature, it was to deal with that issue. And it morphed into a larger study on reanalyzing the classifications because they are based on basically pineapple and sugarcane, land's usability for pineapple and sugarcane. The original intent of the study, as discussed with the legislature, was to update what had been done to meet modern classifications and be more accurate. It was not something that the original concept was to have College of Tropical Ag do this, not OPSD or the Land Use Commission. It became, because it was supposed to be purely a look at the land based on agricultural capabilities. It was modified to its current format because there were a whole bunch of other issues raised at hearings by the public on, what it could be used for, what it should be used for, and all the rest. The current study looks at it more as a planning tool, which wasn't the original intent. Unfortunately, when the study is completed, if there is a redesignation, we'll be stuck with it. But our intent is to ensure that the study is unbiased from a planning standpoint and rather focused more on what is actually usable. I would note, though, that some of the most successful farms in Hawaii right now are not even utilizing land, but they're, what do you call it? Hydroponics. And those have been extremely successful especially with regard to things like lettuce. So I'm not sure these classifications in the long run won't have to be redone again, based on what we're seeing in the agricultural field. But our concern is that Department of Agriculture be more heavily involved.
Commissioner Okigashi.
Clearly part is hard. Is any part of the original intent still part of this study? Because it sounds like the original intent was to upgrade this classification system and to determine whether lands actually, and a new criteria as to what lands actually belong in the A or B or C category, or even change that category to, and what necessary. the problem is what necessary intertwining statutes you're gonna have to modify. So I'm just wondering if any part of that is still there.
You turned your mic off.
Thank you. This is Scott. Uh, Yes, I think that the path they're taking, they are looking at both the Land Study Bureau ratings, which are kind of, like I said, that's the de facto regulatory soil classification system that we use, as well as all the other ones that were mentioned on the video, which have been utilized in different ways over the years. I think what they're trying to look at is what are the strengths and weaknesses of each classification system as a regulatory mechanism, and trying to figure out whether or not any one of them or a combination of them or something new might be better to address, regulatory issues. So ultimately, I don't think anybody can tell you what the end result is going to look like. But I mean, I would say it's useful in that we're trying to look at it again and determine whether the Land Study Bureau that we're using now is the best way to go.
So this is Dan Giovanni. In accompanying the survey that I received was a very interesting document that provided a lot of background on this study as well, and the work that's going on. And my primary takeaway from that whole process, reading that and going through the survey, was that one of the primary things they were attempting to do was to review and update the permissible uses of each classification, A, B, C, D, and E. Are you seeing any, in your experience with the steering committee, any evidence that that's where the focus might be on the permissible uses, or redefining those permissible uses?
This is Scott again. No, not at this point. I think the focus that I've seen is really on looking at each of the soil classification systems that are out there,
Higher level.
to look at what the strengths and weaknesses are, and whether they can be updated in a efficient, cost-effective manner, and to be utilized. So we haven't really been discussing the permissible uses aspect of it. I mean, there's been discussion, but it's more geared towards, hey, things have evolved in how agricultural lands are, and the pressures for use of agricultural lands has occurred. So there has been discussion in that sense, and to see, how well does a soil classification system help you regulate, putting solar panels up.
Commissioner Ohigashi.
This one follow. So how involved is the Department of Agriculture that then our executive officer indicated is involved in this? Because I figure that you need to look at the science or what is going on agricultural land in order to relate it to what classifications mean and how we can modify those classifications to make them more effective. I just was curious as to what the Department of Ag is doing.
Yeah, so the Department of Ag is on the steering committee. They have several people that are attending, including Earl Yamamoto, who's a planner, who, along with me, some of these soil classification systems are as old as we are. And both he and I have been working for the state for a long time. And so he's got an incredible, corporate memory and knowledge, huge working knowledge of talking with a variety of farm ranchers, people doing work in the agricultural district.
As part of the interim report, would there be some kind of survey as to what exactly uses are within, because that would make sense to me that you would say, okay, let's take a look at A lands. And let's see what is doing on it right now and how much what it actually is occurring on those properties right now. And let's look at B lands and C lands and take a look and find out what is the major agricultural pursuit within those areas. And is there any kind of attempt to get that kind of data? Because I think wouldn't that be a first step to figure out what they're actually being used for and then trying to implement the system to accommodate?
Well, I can't speak to that aspect. I haven't seen anything in that direction. I think the real focus is on the soil classification systems. And what, as I said, they're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each one. How easy would it be to, and how expensive would it be to update, especially update it on a regular basis? And who would best do that?
Commissioner Okuda.
This is Gary Okuda. Thank you, chairs. Follow-up question, following up what the executive officer said. So is it within the scope of your steering committee group to look at how like urban farms, the executive officer mentioned hydroponics, but I saw Dr. Kerry Kakazu's aeroponics operation. Guy used to be at Cancer Center, then he decided he's going to be a modern farmer, and it's in a warehouse in Kaka'ako, air conditioned, high tech, computerized spraying of nutrients on the roots of these plants, and very little crop loss because you don't have bugs or people breaking in and stealing stuff. I mean, is that part of the scope of your group, or that's for another day, maybe another body or another time?
I can say, this is Scott, that hasn't, some of that stuff has been discussed and talked about, but it's not the focus of this study. They're really looking at land, the resource base, actual land, and so the soil, the water, and
If I can comment on that a little bit, Dan Ardenker. This is a system that's not keeping up with the times to a certain extent. If you look at all the agricultural land in the state and the competing uses for that agricultural land, you begin to boil down into, well, how many more golf courses do we need on agricultural land? How much solar is going to be needed to be put on prime agricultural land, and all the like. The focus of the study and what's contained in chapter 205 are not really geared towards a system where we're promoting the most efficient and active production of food. I mean, it's more of a state, and to use the bad words, land bank. What is the best agricultural land that we may need for future generations to produce the maximum amount of food that we can? Now, does that mean those lands are actually practical for production? Not always. And does that really mean that the best lands for certain types of agricultural production are A and B lands? Not always. It's a flawed sort of analysis. However, large scale agriculture, traditional agriculture is very land intensive. And the concept behind the ratings was to identify those lands that are best suited for that type of agriculture. Once again, going back to what I was saying about it being based in, corporate agriculture in pineapple and sugarcane. I don't know where we end up with this in the long run. It may be that 10 years from now, the legislature takes another look at it and says, you know, this whole thing doesn't make any sense. You know.
Mr. Okuda.
Thank you, Gary. So follow-up question to Executive Officer, maybe to Mr. Derrickson. So you're telling us basically from a stepping back, neutral position, not looking at any pending petitions or anything like that. The law basically requires us to implement a system which probably in some cases doesn't make sense, but we got to go and do the doesn't make sense kind of thing because we're implementing a statute that is, you know, times have changed, it's dated, but the law is the law, so we got to go and implement that.
No, not necessarily, Commissioner. There is a lot of value to protecting large plots of prime agricultural land, and that is a worthwhile goal. I think what I was getting to was that when you're not looking at land use, but you're looking at food production, these lands may not be where our greatest production of food comes from in the long run. So you have to kind of take that out of the equation. You know, because I agree with you that there are a lot of modern methods of producing food that are extremely lucrative and don't require Class A or Class B lands.
Mr. Carr Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering if you could share with us some of the recommendations and concerns that you've given to the steering committee from the perspective of LUC.
Yeah, this is Scott. At this point, it's not about making specific recommendations. I mean, part of it is they're in this first phase, which is really gathering information. And although a lot of the people in the steering committee, as well as some of the groups that they reach out to, have a history with the soil classification, different soil classification systems, I don't think any one of us is so knowledgeable about not just the Land Study Bureau, but the history and the strengths and weaknesses of each of those systems in providing the type of information that the regulatory body might want to use. So I still think we're becoming educated about these systems and sharing with each other the difficulties. I mean, from a land use commission standpoint, I mean, I can speak to how using the Land Study Bureau's system helps us and also can sometimes hinder activity with regulating agricultural lands.
Mr. Orendecker.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Commissioner Dan Ardenker. One of the things that we're focused on is not so much what I would call practical input, because we're not experts in that. We have no designs on being experts in that, and we don't pretend to be. What we're more focused on is process of the study. In other words, making sure that we're getting good input from all of the people who might have either an interest in this or might have expertise in it. And that's really what we're focused on. That's why we're not here today talking about results from the study or anything like that. Because we want to make sure that the study is as unbiased as possible, and we don't influence it because of some land use issues. We want it to be a study that is inclusive and results in the best possible classification of agricultural lands. And then we'll implement that from a policy standpoint.
Just one quick follow-up then. So when a petitioner comes before LUC to reclassify agricultural lands, how do you folks handle that then? If you're not the experts, who comes in to advise you on how to handle that?
Well, there are two ways. Number one is the soil classifications, provide us, the current soil classifications provide us with information. The soil classifications, when it comes to DBAs, just impact the level of evidence. They don't really impact the use. With regard to special permits, soil classifications impact the allowed uses. For instance, and whether or not there even needs to be a review by us. The best example is solar farms. If it's on CD or E lands, they don't even need to come to us. If it's on
A and or B and C.
B and C lands, I'm sorry, I misspoke. D and E lands, they don't have to come to us. B and C lands, they do. Formerly, and this is how things morph, 10 years ago or so, solar farms were not an allowed use, period, on B and C lands. So, I mean, this is how things are changing. And this is why we suggested a re-review of what is A, B, C, and D lands, or create some other system. But we don't get involved in the value of the land for agricultural purposes. That's the soil classifications. Now, having said that, OPSD is supposed to go and talk to the Department of Agriculture and get their position on whether or not those lands are, if they were taken for urban purposes, for instance, would cause irreparable harm to the agricultural system. But like everything else, we don't do the analysis on that. We will provide the commissioners with what information we have with so that they can make the decision.
Thank you for that explanation.
So you raised a couple questions in my mind with that response. First of all, what do you mean by solar were not allowed, period? What are you talking about?
There was a period of time when solar farms were not allowed on, I think was it B and A
So
and B land?
and B.
It just was, they were simply not allowed
But
And it-
by what? But
by prohibited
And it-
on a chapter 205, 4.5.
so that they couldn't apply for a special permit for an exemption?
No.
So what changed that?
Legislation was passed that modified chapter 205, 4.5 that allowed agricultural lands on B and C lands with a special permit.
Correct. So just FYI for commissioners, some of the more interesting cases that came before this commission in the last 3 years were for large agricultural sections of land that applied for special permits on B and C land for energy projects. And to follow on to that, I got the sense in looking at this survey and all the questions in it, that is a primary focus for review by the study that's ongoing.
We hope so, that is going to be a partial review or a partial focus of this study.
So one of the things that, and I won't cite the specific petition, but I do find it troublesome that the Land Use Commission did approve the use of agricultural lands, I think it was B land, for a major, huge housing project, which was never built. And then they came in and wanted to amend that special permit to allow a solar farm in the interim. How do you see that playing out? Is it still going to be up to the LUC to sort through issues such as that?
Or just to be, this is Scott, to be a little more specific, is that the project on Oahu?
You can cite the
up in-
project.
up in
It's
YPO.
YPO, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
Maybe School.
yeah, so actually, we got to be clear that that's not a special permit. That is in fact urban. It was urban.
It was DBA.
That. So it was district boundary amendment.
Okay, I misspoke,
To
yes.
urban. So it wasn't at that point, the decision had already been made years before to reclassify the land
As urban,
as urban. And so therefore the Land Study Bureau ABCD classifications didn't come into play in terms of deciding to allow them to do the solar farm there. It was that question that you guys had to answer was, do we allow a solar farm to be here for a certain period of time, given that this project doesn't anticipate in building occurring on this portion of the property in that time frame?
that's correct. That's the way it came down. And there were very specific number of conditions on that original DBA that were tied to the housing that never got built. And those conditions had to be reviewed in that context for the solar farm.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's, if I may say, that is portions of the agricultural district that have the most intense focus are those lands that are relatively flat or, you know, gently sloping, have access to water, and are in, you know, a good sun area. Those are also the same areas that a solar farm wants to locate in, a housing development wants to locate in. So that's part of the dilemma that you and the Land Use Commission have to grapple with.
So the other area where they're looking to grapple is with IAL, important agricultural land. And is that going to be addressed in this study as you understand it? Or reviewed? In what context? IAL.
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that they're going to be looking at all lands in the agricultural district, you know, that are subject to right now Land Study Bureau ratings. That would include the important agricultural lands that have already been designated.
In our anchor here. That is a very good question, but it's kind of a circular thing, because part of the IAL analysis is the the soil classification, right? So they feed in on each other, but the soil classification is based more on definitive evidence as to the capabilities, capacity of those individual lands, where the IAL classification uses only soil classifications as only one of the criteria.
Isn't it feasible today for a agricultural parcel to be classified, let's say, as C or D or E, there, or have a special permit thereby? Well, no, let me rephrase. And a agricultural parcel that is D or E has a permissible use of a solar farm. However, is it possible that they would seek IAL designation for that same parcel and thereby prohibit a solar farm?
Theoretically, yes.
No. Anybody else? I think we're good. Thank you.
I'll just say that, Scott, that although OPSD was not able to provide a briefing today for you folks, they are now planning to make sure that they do a briefing with the LUC once they have some recommendations down the road. So they do intend to come before the commission.
But not for the interim report,
That's correct.
because there won't be any recommendations in that interim report.
That's my understanding, correct?
And for example, they won't say, let's get rid of the system, ARIs, and let's just go on straight. Everybody goes in there and does a soil analysis of their own and determine what would be the highest and best use, and then come to the Land Use Commission or whatever government body and say, hey. So none of those recommendations would be.
For the interim report, that's from what I could see from the draft that I reviewed. No, that type of things are not going to be in the interim report at this point.
What utility would it have for the legislature if there are no recommendations? That's a rhetorical question. You don't have to ask.
That's what I was going to ask you, Commissioner.
So in terms of impact, Giovanni, in terms of impact to LUC deliberation, this process is going to be an interim report to the legislature who may or may not act on it. And the earliest they will see it is the 2025 session.
Right. According to OPSD's timeline, that they will have a final report to the 2025 legislators.
And they may or may not act on it.
That's correct.
So it's 2025, 26 at the earliest before we see any impact. Noteworthy impact to LUC from a regulatory point of view.
Assuming that the legislature makes some regulatory changes, legal changes to chapter 205, say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Commissioner Otto.
Was LUC get involved in the APC classifications of the lands? Because I know during the discussion, there was a big fight over, where the marginal agricultural land for pasturage, well, they wanted to raise it to prime, to get the certain tax benefits. And so that kind of question came up to raise or lower in the ABCD classification, so that there was big fighting and that. So I was just wondering if this deal with agriculture on it, or do we, the LUC get involved in that kind of decision?
This is Scott. I think part of what you're talking about is the tax structure that the counties are.
I know, and I know that is a tax structure, but because of that, the landowners want to raise or lower their thing depending on what the tax structure is, and so that's not and it is partly agriculture, because it determines whether it pasture-raised or something would go up or down, and so that's where the use become a thing.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to be answering your question. However, so again, the Land Use Commission, we are bound by using and applying the Land Study Bureau's A through E.
Right. So that's the I asked if
But
you.
it's the county themselves through ordinance that would manage the tax structure, and any tax exemptions or lowering based on soil classifications. I think part of what you're asking about it in terms of raising or lowering, your classification. If you look at the Land Study Bureau, A through E, some lands that are E or D rated, if they're non-irrigated, then they're D or E.
Yeah.
But if they're irrigated or have sufficient water, they can turn into B, C, A-rated lands. So with the application of water, in some cases, an E-rated parcel of land could become an A-rated parcel. I don't know how the counties
So
allow
does
for that
LUC get
factoring
involved
in.
in that decision?
know.
So Scott or Dan, this is Giovanni. Is there any study or information generally available to the public that translates the value, like dollars per acre value of A versus B versus C versus D versus E, that you're aware of?
No, I mean, not to my knowledge. And again, the competition for agricultural lands, like I was saying, particularly lands that are well drained, deeper soils, flat, don't have a lot of rocks.
Has water
There's a
available?
tremendous amount of competition for those lands. So those on the open market, those lands are fetching prices that don't reflect their agricultural use and capability, I think.
Because they have other value.
Higher and better use.
Okay, going once, going twice. Any further questions for staff? Okay, thank you, guys. So, Ariana, is there any other second round of public testimony on this matter? Is there anybody in attendance that wishes to testify that you're aware of?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we'll move on from there. So the next agenda item I have is an update from staff on commissioner training. So, Mr. Orndecker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bit of training that we're going to do is not really intended to be comprehensive, as those of you who have been subjected to it know. When we do commissioner training, we usually take 2 days and we bore the daylights out of you. This is more of a 10,000-foot quick look at some of the things that are happening and some of the things to be mindful of as we move forward. The first sub item under this section is an overview of core responsibilities. To be very brief about it, if I was going to put it in one sentence, I would say very simply that we have to follow the law and rules in making decisions. To a certain extent, this puts borders on our discretion, because we have to do the analysis that are required by statute and by law and by our rules. All sorts of different types of analyses, as you may have seen from some of our hearings. Sometimes we really want to make one decision, but either because of the lack of information or the extent of the adverse impacts, we're forced into a negative decision because we haven't met our obligations. We don't have enough information to meet our obligations. Sort of backing up a little bit, if you look at the history of land use law in Hawaii, you'll notice that in the late 80s to early 2000s, the LUC was the organization that was appealed from frequently. And that led to definitive case law on many important issues. Kapa'a Kai, for instance, and the Turtle Bay case are two good examples that came out of land use commission decision-making that have had a broad impact on how things are done in all of the state agencies in relation to land. Believe it or not, this period of time was very distressing for developers, because appeals led to delays and losses led to rehearing of projects, and then times for those projects was appealed from became excessive. The best example of that is Coa Ridge, and that has had a permanent impact on the psyche of some of the developers, and certainly with LERC, because it took over 10 years to get land use approval of that project. land use commission approval of that project because it went up and down to the Supreme Court 3 times. All appealed from our decisions. What staff tries to do and what you as commissioners should be focused on is ensuring that we have done all of the analysis that is required by the courts to render decisions so we don't get appealed from and housing projects don't get caught in the time morass that comes from appeals and rehearing. The easiest way for someone who doesn't like a project to appeal is to say, oh, they didn't do a proper analysis, they didn't follow the law, they didn't follow the case law. The courts have really rarely, if ever, overturned us because of a factual decision or a substantive decision. Of course, Wyman Gulch is an outlier. What we have been successfully appealed from is cases where we have made decisions that were either procedurally incorrect or ones that have not met our burden of fulfilling our duty under the law or Constitution. To a certain extent, we're unique in government agencies. Most other commissions that deal with land, most other commissions deal with land that has already been classified as urban, such as the Planning Commission, or in the various counties, or conservation, such as BLNM. As a result, their analysis tends to be either more limited or much more environmentally and culturally direct. The only organization that really faces the difficult constitutional questions that we do is the Commission on Water Resource Management. From a practical standpoint, and because we are limited to what is on the record, petitions become a problem when parties have not presented enough evidence to satisfy the decision-making prerequisites. The most likely denial of petitions and motions is a lack of current information with regard to cultural, environmental impacts and mitigation measures. From a pure policy standpoint, our role is to balance the need for housing and other urban uses against the need to preserve land for agricultural and public and cultural purposes. Those are the areas where our discretion lies. So as long as we have met the court-imposed constitutionally derived analysis, we can move forward with doing that analysis. Sometimes that analysis, especially with regard to Kapaa Kai and public trust doctrine issues, is sometimes made not so much from whether or not the information that was presented gives us enough factual information to render a decision, but rather whether or not there is a lack of information to render that decision. That's where our biggest problems lie, where a petitioner and the county and OPSD have not given us enough information to inform us as to whether or not, for instance, there are any impacts on cultural resources on a piece of property. And as we know, Supreme Court decisions have said, to quote their own language, it's not a matter of calling balls and strikes when you come to these issues. We have to act as trustees to protect those interests and those public trust doctrine issues. And if we don't have enough information to render a decision, then we have to deny because we're acting as trustees. That's a little bit different of a mind frame from the way other boards and commissions handle the issues that they're faced with. And this is a really big distinction, and it's really one that requires a lot of thought when we're holding hearings. And if you were saying this, there was a time when OPSD would do that analysis and present us with evidence to support a decision one way or another. That has not happened in the past at least 6 years or more. As a result, this commission has had to be more probative in its questioning to ensure that it has enough information to render a decision with regard to, for instance, Kapaa Kai. and Bridge Inalea and Local 5 Turtle Bay, and the public trust doctrine issues associated with water, cultural resources, archaeological resources, and the environment. Information gathering has become problematic for the commission. And that's why I think this commission has become a lot more focused on asking the hard questions. And that's why some of our decisions are based on the fact that we don't have enough information, even though there's an allegation that there's something going on the land that we need to be protective of. A lot of this is driven by the Constitution. For all intents and purposes, for at least the provisions concerning the protection of agricultural land and cultural resources, we are the entity that affects those provisions. And I would just note that the more discussion on those issues that you folks have, the easier it is for staff to support your final decisions and their written decisions and orders. I have watched this commission struggle with some of the things that have been before it. I'm going all the way back to years ago when we were faced with an SP that did not reveal that there was the petitioner did not reveal that there may have been a trail across the property. And even though we weren't sure what it was, we had to defer the decision until they came back with the information to show us either that that trail was not on the property or that the project would not impact that trail. It's difficult when you have a project that you want to approve, but you don't have the information. The Turtle Bay case, Local 5 Turtle Bay, as it's commonly referred to, created a whole new set of issues for us because we have a lot of petitions that we approved way back when that don't have any time frames on them. And when they come back to us and ask to approve an amendment to that petition, and it's been 40 years or more since they've done any environmental work, we think have an obligation to ensure that the information in front of us is up to date. Which also makes it hard because once again, you have projects that are already approved that may already have been placed in the urban expansion district for the county or counted on as part of the urban expansion district. But the environmental work hasn't occurred in 40, 50 years, and it needs to be updated. It results in, as we've seen recently, in decisions by the commission that say, look, you have to come back to us when you've done this. It's not that we oppose the project, but you have to do this so that we can meet our constitutional obligations. And we'll have an opportunity for the commissioners to ask questions at the end, unless you'd like to do this segment by segment, Chair. It's at your discretion. If there are no questions, then I'm going to ask Scott to talk a little bit about land use policies and guidelines.
Okay, this is Scott, State Land Use Commission. So I'm going to kind of do, Dan was giving you the high level. I'm going to try to get into the weeds a little bit and remind you of.
Scott, let me do just we've been going for an hour and 15 minutes.
Sure.
You got a 2-minute thing or more than 2 minutes?
It's going to be a little bit longer.
So let's take a 5-minute break. So it's now 10:00. What time I got? 11:01. Let's come back at 11:10.
Okay.
We're back on the record. Ms. Chena is going to be absent for a brief period of time, but we'll proceed in her absence. So back to you, Scott.
Okay, yes, this is Scott again. So land use commission's guided in its decision-making by constitutional, statutory, and administrative rule provisions. I'm going to go over some of the at least statutory provisions, some of which connect up to constitutional requirements. So Chapter 205, State Land Use Law, 205-2, the commission originally grouped all the lands into one of four categories, one of four districts, and they set the standards for determining the boundaries of those districts. 205-2 says when you're making your decisions, you have to give consideration to the master plan or general plan of the counties where the land that's being redistricted is. Section 205-4, Part G, decisions got to be made within 365 days. You have to file findings of fact and conclusions of law and impose conditions necessary to uphold the intent and the spirit of this chapter. That's chapter 205. And the policies and criteria in section 205-17, or to assure compliance with representations made by petitioners. Those conditions will then run with the land. Section H, no boundary amendment unless the LUC finds upon clear preponderance of the evidence. It's one of those standards that Commissioner Okuda constantly reminds us and parties coming before us about. So preponderance, clear preponderance of evidence that the change is reasonable, doesn't violate HRS section 205-2 and part 3 of the chapter, which regards important agricultural lands, and is consistent with policies and criteria in sections 205-16 and 205-17. So if you'll notice, if you look at our decisions and orders, we always have sections in there laying out the findings of fact that show how your decision meets those different sections of the law. Section 205-12 about enforcement. Counties shall enforce the land use districts adopted by the OUC and the restrictions on their use, except in the State Conservation District, where that's the Board of Land and Natural Resources, Kuleana. So to section 205-16, which is compliance with the Hawaii State Plan, which is another statutory section. No amendment to your district boundaries nor any other action of the LUC can be approved unless the action conforms to the Hawaii State Plan. Now, I'll talk a little bit about portions of this Hawaii State Plan shortly. Section 205-17, this is the LUC decision-making criteria. When considering reclassifications, the LUC has to consider these 6 specific criteria. And those criteria seeks to balance both protection and conservation with managing growth and development. So some of these criteria are the extent of the conformance with the Hawaii State Plan. And we're speaking of any action that comes before the Land Use Commission. Second one is extent of the conformance with the land use district criteria that are set in section 205-2. The impact of the proposed reclassification on areas of state concern. These things stem from constitutional articles 9 and 12 in particular. That would be the preservation and maintenance of natural systems, maintenance of valued cultural, historical, and natural resources, commitment of state funds and resources, provision of employment and economic development, provision of housing for all incomes, particularly low, moderate, and gap groups, standards and criteria for reclassifying important agricultural lands, county general plans and community development or community development plans, and representations and commitments made by a petitioner in securing a boundary change. So those are some of the primary decision-making criteria that you as commissioners need to bring to bear when approving not just a petition, but also motions to amend. So one of the criteria mentioned was chapter 225, which is the Hawaii State Planning Act. And it's really the state's planning framework. Its intent is to improve the planning process and provide for wise use of resources while also guiding future development of the state. It's a guide for future long-range development, and it provides a basis for determining priorities and allocating the limited resources, particularly public funds. Part 1, sections 226-5 to 226-27 provide the objectives and policies for a very full complement of issues to be considered that include things like housing, infrastructure, water, cultural resources. Part 2, sections 226-51 to 226-65 actually lays out a statewide planning system of which the Land Use Commission and OPSD and the counties play critical roles. Section 226-52, land use and regulatory decision-making of state agencies need to conform with the goals, objectives, and policies stated in the state plan and the use priority guidelines, as well as the state functional plans. Chapter 226-65, Hawaii 2050 Sustainability Plan shall serve as the state's climate and sustainability action plan, and OPSD is the lead agency responsible for providing guidance on its implementation and updates. Part 3 is the priority guidelines. They identify priority areas of statewide concern, including sections 226-108 and 226-109 that cover sustainability and climate change adaptation guidelines, some of which are directly referenced in the LUC administrative rules and need to be included in our petition approvals, in our decisions. Now I'll talk real quickly about chapter 225M, state planning. This is the authorizing a statute for the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development. 225M-2 calls for OPSD to develop and present the position of the state in all boundary change petitions and proceedings. That would include special permits, declaratory rulings, and motions. So it's their job to present the state position before the Land Use Commission. 225M-2 also calls for OPSD to advise and assist private industries, government departments and agencies, and other persons on the requirements of HRS Chapter 343 and its implementation. That's environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. Chapter 225M also provides that the LUC is administratively attached to OPSD. And I think that's all I'm going to hit you with right now, except to tell you that before I was here at the Land Use Commission, I was at the Office of Planning in the Land Use Division. So I have a fairly unique perspective here, because I used to be on the other side where I was helping to develop the state's position by going out and doing the groundwork to talk to the different state agencies who had a dog in the fight in any given petition or a motion, and providing that information and testifying before the Land Use Commission about those positions, both the legality and the background information that you needed to have in your findings of fact and conclusions of law to make your decisions. So I'm well aware of what the role and responsibility is from the OPSD side, as well as what we here at the Land Use Commission have to address in the context of making our findings of facts and conclusions of law. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Scott. Questions, anyone? Commissioner Hata, did you?
There's a lot of conditions and stuff that we're supposed to thing, and so I was wondering, you folks would help us by, all the questions, all of the things that we have to follow, in the report, because it's such a lot actually.
You're right. And we do attempt in our staff reports to cover the bases, and to point out what you need to factor in and to make determinations on in terms of your findings of fact and how you go about the decision-making process, both for petitions, for special permits, declaratory rulings, as well as motions. If you notice in most of our staff reports, we have a section in there that explains, what that process is and how you go about making your decision. However, as I said, part of our staff reports is a survey of the information that's come both from the petitioner who's asking for something to be done, as well as the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development, putting together the state's position and of the county providing information as well. And we try to provide all of that in the context of how those things address the decision-making criteria.
And it says that OP will be the lead for the state, right?
Right.
So we with the LUC can't sort of try to solve a problem if the OP has a position, the one in the Cornerstone one that we just recently passed. We didn't follow OP's recommendation.
If I can address that. First of all, I'd like to talk about the staff reports first before I answer that question. Our staff reports are intended to help give the commissioners guidance as to what the outstanding issues are and what the factual information is that's been provided, because our decision-making has to be based on what's on the record. A lot of times our staff reports will point out inadequacies that need to be addressed at hearing, so that we can get more information out of the petitioner or OPSD or the counties. Now, with regard, but let me finish that by saying, but ultimately it's the commission's decision. There have been many times where staff has expressed concern about a particular petition, and then at hearing, either the commission was able to extract enough evidence from the petitioners so that those issues were resolved, or the commissioners just disagreed. I mean, we're not proud. We're not the decision makers. We're just trying to provide you with as much information as possible. With regard to OPSD's position.
Dan, can you restate Commissioner Hata's question for the record that you're about to answer?
Yeah, the question, if I understood it correctly, Commissioner Hata, was we were presented with information from OPSD and we rendered a decision contrary to that position. That is not uncommon. OPSD's primary obligation is to present us with evidence regarding state concerns and state issues. They are not, when it comes to legal positions, especially, they're not always correct. I mean, in this commission's eyes. And sometimes they give us opinions that are what we feel is, or the commission feels, because they say if staff doesn't make these decisions, that is contrary to the evidence. In recent years, they have provided us with positions that may be the basis for which may be flawed. And the commission has identified that. None of the information provided by anyone is to be taken on its face if you have concerns and you have questions. They're just positions. They're not necessarily bound. We're not necessarily bound by those positions. There have been times when we have taken different positions than the county with regard to things like drainage or lighting. You know, I mean, we have other obligations besides just protecting the county's concerns. So it's a decision, it's a fact gathering process, and this commissioner has discretion to accept or disregard any position or any testimony based on what you hear and what you feel is best. So.
Commissioner Yamane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For either Dan or Scott, what does administratively attached mean? I was reading 225M. What is that?
Technically, what administratively attached means is that the agency that you are administratively attached to is supposed to handle all the administrative work for you. In other words, your travel check, your travel reimbursements, the developing the budget and things, is to prevent the additional expense for those individual agencies of having to hire people to handle those things for them. Technically, that's what it means.
Thank you. Because it kind of refers to 205-1C, but then on 205-1B, it also says the commission shall be part of the office planning OPSD for administrators. Is that the same thing?
Yes.
Actually, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Since Mike's mentioned that, I guess LUC is not administratively attached to OPSD. OPSD, it's part of OPSD and OPS, and so both are administratively attached to DBED. Is that correct?
Actually, we're administratively attached to OPSD, and OPSD is administratively attached to
So
DBED.
we're like the subcontractor, the subcontractor.
To a certain extent, yes. I
That's who
mean,
writes the checks.
yeah, because we used to be directly, it actually has some benefit to us. We used to be directly attached to the Department of Business and Economic Development. It was perceived by the legislature a few years back that certain commissions and divisions could be consolidated with OPSD to prevent duplication. We weren't the only one who was moved. OEQC no longer exists. It is actually a division in OPSD. We maintained our independence. We also have an agreement with OPSD that prevents them from decision-making with regard to our budget and things like that, even though we're administratively attached to them, because it prevents the possible implication that they are somehow controlling our decision-making through their budgets.
Yeah, and one example I think of that is agricultural development board. They used to be attached to ag, and now they're attached to DBED. And there's a subtle message that, or maybe not so subtle message, that the legislature sent when they did that. Is that true?
Yeah, that's there's some history on that goes back to John Y. Hayes' time. And so, you know, I mean, we can talk about that further offline, but that ADC movement was something that was associated with a little bit of a different concern.
Right. Okay, so I guess my main question, or maybe it's to get your thoughts on this, Scott or Dan, Commissioner Lee. 205-17 specifies the 8 to 10 criteria that we're supposed to consider. Some of those are contradictory or conflicting. Some are long-term versus short-term, and some are just judgment calls, right? So I think that's where we will struggle in some of those decisions. And then, so at some point, the LUC may lead or follow, depending on, you know, how dated some of the plans are, the direction, just our what time we woke up and how we felt that morning. But I think, not to relitigate the last issue, but the county general plan and the sustainable communities plans and so forth, sometimes they're stronger than the state plan in certain aspects. So it's like, isn't this, although you mentioned there are guardrails and there's regulatory and legal guidelines that we follow, Tool 517 really is where we're going to have to hash things out as what is more important, and that might change over time. Is that how you would see it?
Well, I think that the language contained in 205 is going to remain for some time. I don't think that's going to change very quickly. But putting those,
But Commissioner Lee, but it's the interpretation that will change, right? Or it's the judgment call that would change over time.
well, yeah, the commission has the ability to make judgment calls with regard to all of those criteria. That's where, when I talk about guardrails, I'm talking more about the 10,000 foot, Supreme Court decisions that we have to adhere to before we get to I would call that a discretionary area. We can, once we get past those guardrails, the rest of the stuff is completely at the commission's discretion, and it always has been. Things like, does it conform to the county plans? That's been handled in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we've had projects in front of us that did not. And what we've said to them is one of the conditions on approval is that you get the county to amend the plan, So there's a lot of discretion in those areas that are contained in Chapter 205. That's the big area of discretion on your part. You have to figure out whether or not the project, when I say you, I mean the commissioners, has met those criteria in one way or another. And sometimes it's not simply a black and white. You have the ability to determine whether or not, based on the evidence in front of you, whether or not those criteria have been met or are okay, or are even not necessary to look at. That's your discretion.
Just last comment. I think that's where the struggle might come, is because some of these criteria are somewhat conflicting. I might say housing is more important because if I don't have a place to live, I'll have to move or not have shelter. But then I might run into some valuable ag land that long term we're going to need. But today and this month and this year, I might need somewhere to live more urgently. So that's where the balance and the discretion would probably be the issue.
Yeah, and that's exactly correct. And that's what the commission's designed and set up for it to do, and is set up for is for the commissioners to look at the evidence in front of them and say, how right now housing is more important than agriculture. I would caution that a little bit there, though, because we are the effectuating body for Article 12 of the Constitution. I mean, there's nobody else who does what we do with regard to protecting agricultural land. So the courts are going to require us to do a pretty good analysis on why that agricultural land can be converted over to housing. But, even the state plan changes and each administration changes with regard to what their priorities are. And this commission has changed over time, even in the 12 years that I've been here, with regard to what some of its priorities are. I would say it's been pretty consistent, but there have been changes. I think that the commission back in the 80s and 90s, when I was appearing in front of it, had a much different focus than this commission does now. And also, the way that discretion has evolved over time is largely a function of the Supreme Court cases that have interfered with that discretion, for lack of a better word, and said, no, you can't do that unless you have done this analysis. The last Coa Ridge appeal, the justices were concerned Let me give you an indication. Okay, so a practical application. Under our rules and under the statutes, there's supposed to be a slightly higher analysis with regard to IAL lands if you're going to convert it to urban. The justices made a distinction between the Coa Ridge case and the D.R. Horton what's the name of it? Ho'opili case. In Ho'opili, the commission didn't have to do as elevated of an analysis because Ho'opili came in with evidence said, yeah, this would probably be IAL land if it was going to be designated. But these are the reasons why we feel housing is more important on this land and how it won't impact the overall food production capabilities of the state. Coa Ridge didn't even do the analysis. They didn't even bring in they didn't even recognize that it was IAL land, and they didn't do anything to provide the commission with evidence. And so the distinction isn't so much that there's a policy difference as between those two projects. The distinction lay in the fact that in one case, Ho'opili, they did the analysis, and in Coa Ridge, they didn't. So the Supreme Court isn't going to get involved so much. They should not get involved so much in our discretionary decision making, as long as we have evidence to support our position. And as I mentioned before, most of the times when we've gotten in trouble, it hasn't been because our analysis was particularly flawed. It's because we didn't have enough evidence to support our analysis. And those are two different things.
Mr. Okuda.
This is Gary Okuda. Yeah, a comment on, I recall what happened at the 201H LALA project, and I don't want to say anything which indicated that I prejudged anything. Okay, I actually had an open mind. But my initial view of looking at the petitions for the 201H project was, this is, I don't want to say a no-brainer, but, okay, we'll be there for a few hours. And why is the staff keeping us overnight? Because, this is really, a no-brainer. And there's a Kapa'akai report. And so, okay, no problem. And Don Chang asked the cultural consultant, well, have you considered the Kapa'akai questions? And I think, not to read Don's mind, but she's just checking the boxes, right? Yeah, okay, the consultant would say, because the consultant wrote the report saying Kapa'akai standards were complied with, I did it. But the consultant testified, Kapa'akai, what's that? And yeah, it was on Kauai. And so Don tried to rephrase the question. Well, did you look at these standards that are laid out in the Kapa'akai case? And the consultant said, I don't know. I didn't do that. I followed what I think some other office talked about. And when the session broke at that evening, my thought was, this valuable housing project where the mayor's gotten financing, it's ready to go. It's going to go down the toilet because this is an incompetent presentation. Now, to Bernard Carvalho's credit, that evening, I understand, he was on a walk. We flew back to Kauai, and even though the naysayers were telling him, hey, this is a dead project, he found a witness who actually, she had I think a master's in archaeology, and she's from the Waimea Valley area. And she put in the evidence that basically saved the project. I remember my last question to outside counsel, guy from Honolulu, who the county had hired, was, let me give you the citation to the Kapa'akai case. Here's the Hawaii report citation. You gotta address this tomorrow. And so I think, I don't think we're against housing, and I agree with the executive officer says. If we check off these boxes, then the standard that the Supreme Court has said is, if we believe the traffic light was green, or if we believe this is a good project, even if other people say no, you know, the Supreme Court said it's the discretion of the Land Use Commission, but where the box isn't checked off, which should be a simple matter for applicants, that's where the problem is. But I was horrified because I thought, you know, they've got financing. This is going to be needed housing, you know, and just because a consultant who signed off on a report says, I don't know what my report is talking about. I mean, it's like, holy moly. Anyway, editorial comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hoygashi.
That was my first meeting. You know, this meeting on fly. Anyway, I think the problem that I want, or the thing that I want to impart to, since I'm a short timer anyway, is that the danger is not the danger, but the problem is that the standards for standing to appeal is very, very open. And that any decision, whether or not there's an intervener or even somebody yelling and screaming in the crowds or putting on evidence as a public witness, any decision without the necessary backing is susceptible to an appeal. And an appeal is bad because it costs money on the developer and weighs on their resources, and it creates a more problem for the continuation of the project in my opinion. And I think that with apparently the new hire that the land use staff has hired to look up old projects, that this will become a permanent type of issue as to when do we declare, or when do we find that circumstances are so changed that we're going to have to say, not for ready, let's pull back, save everybody time and money, and try and figure out what things have to be done to meet that requirement. And it's a sensible thing to do. Now, people will say, well, you're against housing, but I don't have the statistic in front of me, but I believe that the amount of housing or the amount of housing projects that the Land Use Commission has approved that hasn't been built would put a big dent, or at least maybe not maybe needed, but put a big dent in what the housing needs in the state are. And then everybody's going to say, well, but you guys are the ones that's stopping it on the housing. And we say, no, you know, they have the right to proceed. And if you come back to us with a change project or something different, then the Supreme Court has put us all on these obligations. So it makes sense for us to follow the law. And, you know, and that's my philosophy here. You know, can't hide it that we're lawyers on this side of the table, but you know, essentially we're given parameters, and we're trying to stick by it. The last comment I wanted to ask the Attorney General, because I just overheard some comments that she made that may make the Kapakai analysis more important in our review as we go forward. And I don't know if the Attorney General has anything to comment on it, the recent experience in front of the court.
Julie Chena, Deputy AG. I just made a Kapakai comment because I was watching Supreme Court proceedings yesterday. My deputies had 2 oral arguments. One of the justices did ask, you know, some probing Kapakai questions. And so I think that when you do an analysis, it's going to be part of what you're gonna have to do in the future and have to look at closely. So, yeah.
What I was hoping, and what you're saying is, what I gather from what you're saying is that, look, this is going to be more of a central question in the future. Old projects that never went through it will have to go through it. This is going to be the standard, I believe, that this court is going to require. And the heightened importance of it, even in discussion, rather than a written opinion, seems to indicate to me that to be on the safe side, that this is the direction that may have to be taken. And given a short timer, I'm glad that you guys will have to decide that.
Mr. Chair, if I may, a couple of comments.
Mr. Orendaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with both Julie and Lee. One of the problems that we're facing is that this Kapakai analysis issue has become very important to the Supreme Court, and recent decisions would indicate that the state cannot render any type of decision unless it's done a Kapakai analysis on anything in any division. We were even talking about roadways and things the DOT does and everything else. In the land use arena, one of the things that the counties have not faced is that if we weren't here to do that analysis on larger projects, they would have to do it. I mean, right now they kind of escape because they know we're going to do it. But if we disappeared tomorrow, they would have to do it. The second comment that I would like to make is that I think you heard me mention early on, and which Lee just reiterated, is that one of the reasons that we do this is to prevent appeals up and down for developers. There's a big cost savings in telling a petitioner, look, why don't you come back in 6 months when you've gotten the evidence put together to support this, as opposed to, you know, we're going to render a decision, but you're probably going to get appealed from, and then that's months and years and everything. It's better for us to do that from a developer's standpoint than to send them up and down to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that Lee said was very, very important, and that is you don't even have to be a party to a proceeding to appeal from one of our decisions. If you're just sitting in the audience, or even if you look at YouTube a month later or a couple of weeks later and decide, you know, they made a mistake with this, I'm going to appeal. They can do it. They don't even have to be a party. So whenever we throw a decision out there, if we haven't followed the Supreme Court's guidance, we throw it out there to the wind and say, anybody going to appeal? It doesn't, you know, even if they were not a party, you know, which is why we've been appealed from several times. So although it would appear on its face that we are, you know, being somewhat supportive of community issues, it's not simply that. It's that we are trying to prevent a situation where we're going to cost the developer a whole ton of money because we're in support of a project, but we don't have the evidence, so they get appealed from. That's part of our goal, is to prevent the developers from having to expend a significant amount of money on a Supreme Court appeal, which can quadruple the legal costs for them. Anyway, just those comments.
Thank you. Anything further, commissioners? Commissioner Smith.
Thank you. I'm curious, why would a petitioner not provide the evidence that's required? Is there not a checklist, or is it not clear what they need to come to the table with?
Sometimes, let's take the Kauai case, for instance. The consultant that they hired just did a lousy job, you know, and we didn't know until we went to hearing and the community came out and said, you know, there are all these other issues that they didn't touch on. And she didn't understand the significance of Kapaka'i, and so therefore she didn't do a coherent analysis on it. We've had other cases where we go to hearing and we discover that, and giving the consultants the benefit of the doubt, the consultants didn't even know about these cultural resources that they're faced with. Because in all honesty, a lot of cultural practitioners are hesitant to talk to consultants because for a lot of reasons. One of them may be just that, they don't want it broadcast that this is what their family has been doing on this land for generations. They don't trust, the consultants because they think they're going to spin whatever they say or their motivation. We don't know. I mean, we don't know. A lot of times we don't know until we go to hearing that there's even an issue. That case on Kauai was a good example. Despite what the consultant may have thought she was doing, there was a lot of things that she didn't even consider that came out at hearing, such as the salt mining activity that was going on below the project and things like that. And when that happens, we have to say, look, we've got this testimony. You got to find out whether it's credible and whether or not what you've submitted to us meets Kapaka'i, and your proposed mitigation measures will prevent damage to these cultural practitioners. So, like I say, it's a lot of time it's not because they're doing anything devious or trying to sneak something by us. It's just either because the community is not interacting with the consultants, or because the consultants don't understand what their role is, that we don't get the evidence that we need, or we don't get all of the evidence to render a decision.
Yeah, I understand the variables, but I still have the question, what do you provide to an applicant or a petitioner, whatever the term is, that explains to them exactly what they need to do? Or do you do that?
We do and we don't. I mean, if a petitioner comes into us and asks us what we need to do, and usually a good petitioner will come into us several times during the course of preparation for a hearing, and we'll go over the inadequacies in their petition or question them as to whether they have done their analysis. But it's not our role to do that. And part of the reason for that is that these are not, the analysis is not a checklist. Making a decision on these different areas is a checklist for us, but they need to look at Kapaka'i, and they're usually represented by attorneys who should know the law, and the attorney should walk them through whether or not they've met those criteria. This is like I said, as I've said before, a tribunal rather than simply a commission, so to speak, where we can make decisions administratively, ministerially. We will help petitioners whenever we're asked to through these things, but they should understand what their obligations are, especially in light of the fact that most of the petitioners, well, let me put it to you this way. If a petitioner has done a really good EIS, if it's a new project and they've done a really good EIS, they've satisfied everything. I mean, and we're going to approve that EIS as the accepting authority. And then the petitioner's merely got to distill what's contained in the EIS into its petition. We have situations where the attorneys don't provide them with enough guidance, or the consultants don't provide the petitioners with enough guidance. That's usually where we run into problems. And that's a function of the free market, I guess, for lack of a better word, because there are some attorneys who are much better in this than others. And there are some attorneys who don't understand, what they're supposed to be doing.
May I ask one last question, please?
Yeah,
Thank
Carter
you.
Smith, please
Thank you.
continue.
Is Kapa'akai the only Supreme Court decision that the LUC is obligated to consider?
No, there are a number of Supreme Court decisions that impact all sorts of different aspects of our decision-making.
And how would we know that? Where is that information?
Most of that information, I mean, it's available. We've just posted a bunch of things to the websites. But a lot of that information, and this is what we were trying to do, we tried to do with our rules when we updated them, is to put that into the rules, to amend our rules to reflect those Supreme Court decisions, and to require, so that petitioners know by looking at our rules what they have to submit to us for evidence.
I think the question was, what is available to the commissioners themselves so that we are fully informed of our obligations relative to Supreme Court decisions? Is that the question? Carter Smith? Did I state that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's one of the reasons we're here right now, is that we do training sessions. Your tenure on the commission has been short enough that you haven't been subjected to one of our 2-day bores, but we will be doing another one, probably this summer, that will go through all of this stuff. A lot of it is contained in our orientation materials. We don't go into specific cases, but the general decision-making policies are contained in there. It's difficult for us to cover all of the cases that impact us on a general basis, because sometimes we have unique issues that arise during the course of a petition that are impacted by some Supreme Court decision. But generally, there is a very, very good discussion of Kapa'akai and public trust doctrine issues that's up on our website. That was a video of, it's up on our website, like Jonathan's video. Yep, that goes through an analysis of, what's necessary and what is required. If there is a specific decision, Supreme Court decision or federal court decision that impacts a particular petition, staff will always bring it to your attention.
In the staff report.
In the staff report, yeah. But
yeah,
those are the
I would add
resources.
that one of the values that I've derived from my short term on this commission is that the collective knowledge and experience of this commission is shared among the commissioners. So I've never felt like I was expected to know it all, but somebody here does. Collectively we got the bases covered pretty well, and we can rely on each other and rely on staff. So it kind of covers the bases. But I share your concern that, some of these decisions that Supreme Court makes, I don't have legal experience. What does it really mean for me? What am I being asked to do to put that forward? So I think we need to look to the staff reports. We need to look to the trainings, and we need to look to the expertise of fellow commissioners and the AGs to bring it all together. Exactly.
Yeah, the expertise of commissioners is widespread and varied. That's why there's 9 of you and not 1. We don't expect everybody to know everything. One of the best examples of that is Chair Giovanni's experience in engineering. His expertise really helped us a lot when we were doing the cemetery case with regard to drainage. And the solar issues. Everybody brings something a little bit different to the table. I think the most important thing that I can say to any commissioner is to listen listen not only to your fellow commissioners, but to the evidence that's been presented to you. It's complex. There are a lot of different areas and a lot of different topics that get covered during the course of a petition that you may not be an expert in, and we don't expect you to be, but somebody else probably is.
I also want to make a comment about follow up to Commissioner Carr Smith's inquiry about checklist or something up front. You know, I just had the quote unquote pleasure of going through the process with the county of Kauai. And they formally have a step in the process, which is called a pre-application meeting with the planning staff, in which they point by point tell you what you got to do. And it was so helpful. I don't know if there's an equivalent that you do informally. I don't think this is formally in their published process. Are they? I don't know.
If I could,
I'm going to recognize Scott.
yeah, this is Scott. So based on your question, Commissioner Carr Smith, our administrative rules do have a section on the form and contents of a petition, and it's lengthy, and it spells out exactly the information that needs to be contained in any petition comes before us.
It does, yeah.
And when a petition does come in, that's kind of our checklist. That's my checklist that I use as a staff planner when I'm reviewing a petition to see whether we're going to accept it as a complete filing.
Isn't that day zero when you accept it as a complete application?
Actually, it's not day zero. When we get a petition in, we have 30 days to review it for completeness. Within that 30 days, if we identify that it's lacking in some way, we provide back in a letter, and we specifically cite to our administrative rules section what's lacking. So a petitioner that actually comes before us after we've accepted their petition as complete, and when I say complete, that means that they provided information on all those different areas. That doesn't mean that we've gone through and done an investigation to determine whether or not that information is correct or current or accurate. It's just that for us, they provided information in that area, and it is correct. And I can tell you from my experience at OP as a planner back before, when I was developing the state's position before the Land Use Commission, that was our job. Our job was to fact check. Our job was to go to other state agencies, and like the Department of Transportation. They've indicated that there's no traffic impacts here. Is that correct? Do you agree with that? Do you have mitigation measures that you believe need to be included? That isn't the Land Use Commission's role. We don't do investigations in that. And when you make your decisions need to be made based on facts in the record, and there is an opportunity for you to question whether those facts are supported. And that's partly OPSD's role, it's partly the county's role, but the primary role is whoever the applicant petitioner is. They're the ones that have to provide clear preponderance of evidence. They're the ones that are on the hook for the facts that sway your decision making.
If I can talk to that a little bit.
Just a minute, I held off Gary, so I wanted to give him up.
Yeah, Gary, could a real quick, if as one of the short-term lawyers on this side of the table, we're going to term limit out. But just an editorial.
Enough of the excuses.
Yeah.
Just say
Yeah,
what you
okay.
want to say.
Yeah. I think in response to Commissioner Carr Smith, I think part of the problem why we have these deficiencies is frankly, there's in my view, a reduction in the quality of legal representation being provided by lawyers in town. Simply put, the younger lawyers, they're just not willing to work. Maybe it's a generational thing, but that's just reality. You know, I recall about 35 years ago, I did the land use change, which helped build St. Francis West Hospital, which is now Queens Hospital, out in the middle of a cane field. And I remember I personally went to see the staff planners at the city, you know, checking with government people, talking story, actually more than talking story, begging for advice, just to make sure the process would go clearly. And I think part of the problem, which we probably can't fix, is the fact that today young lawyers who are tasked with a lot of these things, many of them, they just don't want to work. And I don't know what we're going to do about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of comments. I think a lot of what has been happening over the past several years, and I'm very blunt about it, is because OPSD is not doing its job. You know, we used to get presented. OPSD not only presented us with significantly more valuable evidence, but they used to meet with every petitioner on every item at least 2 or 3 times before we went to hearing. That was their role, because they're the ones who can help them develop a position based on, you know, what the state's concerns are. That doesn't happen anymore. Staff has been thrown into a role of having to guide petitioners when we formerly didn't have to. That being said, we make every attempt to do so, and you have to distinguish between new petitions and motions. New petitions, we work very closely with the petitioners on developing their EISs to make sure they cover every issue, and with petitioners with regard to their final petition. One of the things that we cannot do is force ourselves on petitioners with regard to things. We can only make suggestions. And we have to be careful how we make those suggestions, because we're not parties to the proceedings. We're supposed to be, even staff, so are supposed to be objective. You know, we're not.
They can use whatever you say.
Yeah.
In their appeal, if they were denied.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be the ones to provide advice on what the commission is thinking. They should have competent attorneys, and they should go to OPSD and talk to them. Our staff is not there to provide them an issue on appeal. And, you know, I take umbrage with that, because I know I've worked for several years with them, and I've seen cases where they try to help the person, and it goes and bites them in the hole, especially Scott's good friend. But you know, that's what these guys are big guys. They have money. They have the ability to put together projects, and then to blame our staff for not providing the right information. That's ridiculous. OPSD is supposed to provide it. They don't want to do it. We do our best to make sure they meet the criteria that we've laid out. And I think they've been doing a fabulous job. And if there's any questions as to why, or as to what their lack of doing, I think that I go back to the proposed rules. I don't see anything wrong with it. It gives, and I'm hopeful that the more precise we are in rulemaking and to show what they actually need, the more these so-called poor developers would be able to function in this environment. That's such a. I'm sorry.
Okay, enough. No, you're fine. Point well taken. Commissioner Kahele.
Let me make a couple of points. Dan, we all know what happened at our last hearing up in Kuna, right? OPSD didn't care about the Kapakai analysis. That put us in a spot. We had motion made to approve the project. Then we had motions to deny the project. So you know, what do you do to fix it? What do you go about in, and how do you go about in fixing this problem? If they are not,
Wait, Chair, point of clarification. Did OPSD say that they didn't care about the Kapolei analysis?
no, but they actually supported the project.
Right, but that's,
Point of clarification, it was a motion.
I'm not gonna
It
get into a
wasn't,
disagreement.
wasn't the project, it was a motion to extend.
no, but the statement that Commissioner Kaheli said, so I just wanted to clarify that that's not what OPSD said.
Yeah, I don't think you should be discussing any pending matters that haven't been agendized for today.
If I may, because I think that,
Yeah, keep the discussion
yeah,
generic.
yeah, that from a generic standpoint, a lot of times, and this is where the wheels usually come off the bus, a petitioner will come to us or we will go to them, because sometimes we do it on our own. And we'll discuss what's deficient in a petition. And they'll simply say, well, we don't agree with you. And we can't stop them from coming before the petition if we disagree with them. You know, they have a right to come before the petition commission, and then the commissioners get to decide whether or not they're deficient. Sometimes the debate is over whether a particular analysis is even legally required. And then once again, set the commission's discretion as to whether or not that is to occur.
Yeah,
They render that.
fair enough. I'd like to return to the Commissioner Kahele's comment as I understood it, because I think it's an important point. So this commission looks to the parties that are represented, whether it be the petitioner, the county, and the state, for their positions and their recommendations to this commission. The commission has the discretion independently to agree or disagree with any one of those parties. Of course, it's very helpful when we all agree. Sometimes we won't. And we have to take that in our judgment and make the best decisions we can. Is that a fair?
Yes, no, it was just,
When you said you'd like to fix it, can you elaborate just for a moment on the problems generically, not specific to that case? But
well, I guess my point was, because there was an analysis that needed to be done on phase 2. I wasn't sure why, OPSD came out with their position.
so you agreed to. You can take that under consideration and agree with them or disagree with them as a commissioner, right?
Right. Well, considering they're a state agency, you know, I would be assuming that they'd be working with the land use and finding out all what's required closely before they even come out there and take on position.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, you know,
We gotta be
that
careful.
was my concern.
Fair enough. We gotta be careful not to go back to that specific.
Yeah, in an ideal world, that would happen.
Yeah, I'd just like to end this on the note that we do have the discretion. Occasionally, we will see flawed presentations. In my personal experience of a few years, I have found great value in the representations that have been put forth by OPSD and the county in support or in helping to negotiate specific conditions that would be applied to a decision and order. So I don't want the record to reflect that we have a quote unquote flaw that is ever present, so to speak, because I do think it's a situation in which cases come before us, and on occasion we see that the record looks to be relatively incomplete, and we would wish that the parties would be in a position to make the thing very clear for this commission, but yet the commission has to be very probative so that it can render an informed decision. And that's unfortunate, but sometimes that happens. But any final comments? Mr. Ornding?
Mr. Chair, we didn't really get to the last section of our presentation. But one of the things that triggered this presentation on the part of staff was Commissioner Okuda was very helpful and provided us with some analysis of recent case law and how it impacts our decision making. And I would urge the commissioners to all look at that. As Gary has pointed out, it's more of a statement of the law than it is anything else. And some legal minds may disagree with him, but I think it's a pretty good analysis. But if I can finish, I would urge the commissioners to look at that. The real purpose of this meeting was to this agenda item was to kind of talk about those things. But underlying all of this discussion is this simple fact that we are mainly dealing with contested case hearings, and that puts us in a slightly different position, and it puts staff in a slightly different position because we cannot take a petitioner's hand and walk them through everything. As Scott has pointed out several times, that's OPSD's job. We're constrained. The most we can do is point out inadequacies, but we can't tell them how to answer the question, and we can't guide them on the law, in a large part because let me, for a little bit of an aside here, specifics. One of my last appearances in the private sector before the Land Use Commission was when I was working for Molokai Ranch, and we had to allow petition in front of the commission. And Tony Ching, who was then sitting in as the executive officer, gave us some advice on what would happen, what we could do if things didn't go the way we wanted them to. And in the course of the hearing, we did what he told us to do, and the AG and the commission said, "You can't do that." Tony ended up resigning at that meeting because he had guided us in a direction that the commission felt it had liability for. So we have to be very, very careful how we handle petitioners. And yes, that puts a lot of the onus on the petitioners to do a good job. As I said, some attorneys know how to do that, some don't. And I wouldn't limit the laziness to just new attorneys. I'd say there's some old attorneys in town who are pretty lazy too. Not Gary and not me.
So enough with the opinions.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, that's kind of what this.
I'd like to
commission is
ask
struggling with.
that these documents that were prepared by Commissioner Okuda be made readily available. Can they actually be emailed to the commissioners? Are they such? I mean, or do you?
Yes, we can do that.
Can you do that?
We can email them.
And then can we have, after the commissioners have some time to review them, I think this is a very robust area for discussion. So can we agendize another follow-on session?
Yes.
Under training to specifically
Talk about these.
talk about these things and make sure that Commissioner Okuda is available at that meeting? No, I'm serious. Commissioner Okuda, disclaimer.
I just want to say this because this was in my cover email to the chair, who had or Nick call me up and force me to do this. But all joking aside, I have no pride of authorship in any of this. And as I put in my email, this is just my personal view of what I think the important points are. Democracy and the rule of law, I put in the email, always functions better if we have robust disagreement. So, you know, if you think I'm wrong, I'm always happy to hear about it, or you think my view should be modified, because I'm not the guru here. Okay, this is really start of discussion, and it's just my personal view. And again, I have no pride of authorship, and so please keep that in mind.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Commissioner Okuda. Okay, no further business to discuss today. I declare this meeting adjourned.